Hey everyone, my name is Erica. I am our Graham student ministry pastor. I'm one of our teaching pastors here on staff, and I am so glad that you are here with us this week. I was talking with someone recently, and I was just sharing that I feel really, really passionate, about what I get to do here. I love what I get to do. But I feel really, really passionate about also being able to help women develop their leadership skills and grow within that, especially in places where maybe they've been historically underrepresented. And as I was telling the story, I was like, oh, I realized my origin story. And my origin story is that when I was 5 years old and I'm learning about the US presidents, and I learned that there had never been a woman president. And I was outraged. I had the classic 5-year-old indignant, how dare they sort of energy. And I was like, I will be the first woman president. And then I learned about the responsibilities of the president and realized I didn't want to be the president anymore. I didn't realize, though, the roles of the president until after I worked really, really hard to convince my dad to become president, because Obama's daughters got to meet the Jonas Brothers and I wanted to meet the Jonas Brothers. And it just seemed like the only for sure way for me to meet them. He didn't take the bait. So, alas, this is where we are. But I think that all of us have these thoughts and ideas of, if I could lead in this big, huge, epic kind of way, here's the kind of leader that I would be. If I could be a president, a ruler, a CEO, I would do it a really certain way. And as ancient Israel is getting ready to welcome their second king, we are going to find a king who, in some ways, is a lot like us. And in some ways is a lot like us in ways that maybe we don't always want to admit. Today we're going to take a look at David. And he is the king that we have by far the most content on. In terms of the same name being used over and over in the Bible, it is Jesus and then it is David. Okay, his name is brought up a lot. There are 66 chapters written about him. And so as much as I would love for this to be able to be sort of a deep dive, this is really we're catching the highlights. There's so much about David's life that we will not be able to cover today in our time together. So we'll hit the highlights, and then we will look at some timeless principles that I think will help us to have hope in even the harshest, darkest, and scariest moments. We are going to start out together in the book of 1 Samuel. If you do not have a Bible, there is a great resource called YouVersion, and it is a free app that you can download, and then you have the Bible with you at all times. And it has great features for reading plans, for maybe taking a bit more of a deep dive into a topic or something that you want to be able to study more. It reads the Bible out loud to you. It has some really, really great features, and we highly recommend that you download that and use that. 1 Samuel, the book, opens with us learning about Samuel. And Samuel is a prophet. And so he is helping Israel get their first king, whose name is Saul. And we actually talked about him last week. And so if you want to know more, you can go back and you can watch that or listen to that and learn all about Saul and what kind of a leader he was and his story of becoming king. But as it becomes clear that eventually Saul will no longer be a good king, Samuel has to go to Saul and say hey man, I know it's a bummer, but God is about to raise up a new king to take your place. And that king, you guessed it, is David. And David was not culturally expected at all to actually become the king. His family was not from a super intense status. They were farmers. He was a shepherd. And in fact, when Samuel shows up to select David to be king, he feels like he's supposed to go to this guy's house. So he goes to David's dad's house, and his dad, I kid you not, brings out all of his siblings and then brings out David, and really does it reluctantly. We've got this, I have this one other son who works in the field. I guess we could you could see him, and as soon as he sees David, he's like, this is the guy. This is the next king. And so that's the role that David begins to step into. And so David is anointed. He is set aside for this next phase of his life. He's going to become ruler, and he then goes on to secure his first military victory, which is defeating Goliath. And David and Goliath is one of the few biblical references that I think is still very actively used in pop culture. Now, we mostly hear it in terms of sports, right? Like the underdog team and like the expected to win team. And then when the underdog team wins, or like the athlete that maybe, is younger or smaller, or it's not expected that they'll do great things, and then instead they do incredible and remarkable things, that David and Goliath thing is still a through line in our culture. But at this point, David isn't actually king. Saul is still ruling, and sometimes David would be with Saul and learning, and sometimes David would be at home with his dad. And so he's at home with his dad, and all of his brothers have gone off to war to fight the Philistines. And his dad's like, "Hey, I need you to take some food to your brothers." And so he goes to take food, and he shows up to the front lines of the battle. And there's this guy from the Philistines named Goliath, and he's tall and he's mighty, and he is also very, very intimidating. And David hears Goliath saying all these terrible things about his people and about God, and he is getting fired up. He is full of rage, and he is ready to do something. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 17, that's where we're going to be. So you can flip there, swipe there, tap there, whatever that looks like. David is going up to them, and he's like, what's going to happen? And this is what his brother says in verse 28. Now, you're going to hear this, and you're going to be like, wow, that's really, really intense. But I think we have a reason for it. Okay. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28 says, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Now, this sounds super intense, but I gotta be honest, this sounds like classic older sibling thing to say. Like, I got passed over to become king, and now you're just showing up here and you don't even have to fight. You're just here to watch. Gosh, that is so annoying. Like, I would be salty if one of my younger sisters was selected over me when it was expected that I would rule. Like, okay, like we can understand that. Verse 29, "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David is doing and saying is overheard. He's like, this is not okay. We've got to do something. Like, I want to be part of this. And so word gets back to Saul, and Saul is like, we've got this. Verse 32, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." David knows that he can do something about this problem, and he goes to do it, and he is going to do the best that he can for Saul, for the Israelites, and for God. Verse 38 says, "Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. 'I cannot go in these,' he said to Saul, 'because I am not used to them.' So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand approached the Philistines." Here is what I love about this moment. David shows up, and David shows up as himself. David was literally offered the best that could have been offered to him in that moment. The best materials, the best supplies, and he chooses to address this situation with his strength, with his knowledge, with the unique ways that God has wired him to be able to solve this problem. He knows that he is doing the best that he can with what he's been given. Let's jump to verse 45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. The threat, the terror, the concern is killed. David is a hero. He is crushing it, and he knows that he is crushing it because he showed up as God's servant, not as a warrior for his own recognition. There is a humility in him and how he is choosing to lead in this moment. There is an awareness that even in the face of evil, there can be hope, and God can do incredible things. Which leads us to the first question we have to ask ourselves. How do we lead? How do you lead? Here's the deal. I have well written off the idea of becoming president of the U.S. And no one wants me running, like being a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But I lead. You lead. You lead in your schools when a group project comes up and someone has to take charge and get this project done. You lead in your families when decisions have to be made. You lead in meetings when you know, okay, we've got to set the right tone for this and for this discussion. And I know that I'm a person who can do that. How do you lead? Do you lead in the ways that God has uniquely crafted and created you to lead? Or do you lead in the way that everybody else expects you to lead? David was uniquely suited to kill Goliath. No one else there had the skills that he had, or if they did have those skills, they chose to not use them. And if he went in just like everybody else, full of armor and a helmet and a sword, he would have been killed just like everybody else. So lead quietly or humorously or boldly or any of the other million ways that you could be wired to lead, but do it in such a way that gives God glory, not you and not other humans. David goes on to become a general, and he has incredible success, and his actions reveal to all those around him that his heart beats to bring God glory. Even when Saul is literally chasing him down to kill him, David had this prime opportunity to be able to just kill Saul in a way that wouldn't have incurred any harm on him, and he doesn't. He continues to lead with integrity. There is a famous phrase aside from David and Goliath that gets attached to David's life, and it is that David was a man after God's own heart. And this is attributed to him when Samuel is going to Saul beforehand and being like, hey man, this next guy who's going to lead, he is a man after God's own heart. It gets attributed to him well after his life, when he gets brought up in the book of Acts and they are recounting the history of Israel, and he is like, and there was David, and then he was a man after God's own heart. And if we only had Samuel, if we only had 1 Samuel, not 2 Samuel, then David's reputation would have been uncomplicated. But alas, we have 1 Samuel and we have 2 Samuel. And actually, they were originally just Samuel, but the scroll was far too big to carry around, so they had to split it into two. But it's in 2 Samuel that we begin to see things fall apart for David. 1 Samuel ends with the death of Saul, and 2 Samuel chapter 2 gives us David becoming king. And he is mourning and he is grieving the loss of the previous king. He is sad for his friend whose dad was the king. David gets the Ark of the Covenant and he puts it in Jerusalem, and then he says to God, let me build you a temple. And God looks at him and says, no, let me build you a dynasty. And it is in this moment that we learn that Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, is going to come from David's family. This is the thing that David and the Israelites, they had been dreaming about, they had been praying about, they had been longing for, and they were waiting for the Messiah to show up. And the Savior was going to be connected to David. What a dream. What an incredibly cool, beautiful, wonderful moment. This would be like if someone came to one of us and said, your future descendants, one of them will be the best player the Mariners has ever seen and will secure a World Series victory for them. We would be like, amazing. This is great. What a dream. David is so excited about what is to come for his family and his life, and he gets all these promises and he's crushing it as king, and then things begin to go awry. We are going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 11 for a little while now. So again, flip there, swipe there, tap there, do whatever you need to be able to get there. It will also be up on the screen. So if that's way more your vibe, to just read along with whatever's on the screen. That is cool too. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." Okay, things have now officially gone off of the rails for David. He didn't do the things that he was supposed to be doing. He was creeping on women. He was abusing his power and influence. And now there is a very real consequence that is staring him down. And I think that there are two really, really valuable lessons for us here in these 5 verses. Number one, when there is something that you are supposed to be doing, especially as a leader, do that and don't do something else. Kings and leaders used to fight alongside their armies. It was expected that David would go to war, but instead he stayed behind. And I don't want us to become a bunch of legalistic people who are like, I do this only because I'm supposed to do it, and there's no heart behind it. But sometimes we just have to do the things that we are supposed to do. 2 of my really good friends are super passionate about people's stated values and their actions lining up, being the same. And so I know then if I'm going to say I am your friend, well then my actions need to back that up. I have to make sure to text them and call them and think of them and include them in my life and show up at their houses at times when it can feel really inconvenient. It is important for me to show up and be there because it's being a good friend. And if you are going to be the king, the ruler, the leader, you go the places that you're supposed to go and you do the things that you're supposed to do. Even on days when you're like, I don't know that I'm 100% feeling it. This is who you've stated you want to be. You show up and you do those things. Here's the second thing. A misuse of power does not bring God glory and has real negative consequences. If you have any influence over someone, which almost everybody does, we have to be so intentional with that influence. And when I say almost everybody, I mean almost everybody. You have influence over the younger people in your life. You have influence over your coworkers. You have influence over how you are kind to a barista in the morning. We have influence over other people's days. I think the only people that don't have influence are people who have completely cut themselves off and are not talking to anyone and are living on their own. But honestly, that has influence too, because the people that have been cut off, they are sad and they are grieving as well. I once accidentally taught my friend's kids a song that could get really, really annoying. And I just was singing it absentmindedly, and I forget that small children pick up on that. And so I looked at them and I was like, okay, wait. This song is an Auntie Erica only song. You cannot sing this song if I am not around, because I did not need the phone call the next morning that was like, what? Why don't you teach our kids that? It's pretty annoying. And that's a really, really small version of how this plays out. Just a minuscule recent moment where I didn't realize the influence that I had and I misused it. So how do you speak to your employees? Do you allow the people around you to ask questions or learn more? Or do you require immediate perfection from people? Do you gossip behind people's back because it makes you feel good and you are unaware of the toxic wake that it is leaving behind you? Do you see the people around you as objects, or do you see them as people who are created in the image of God? Are your employees or coworkers or your friends, are they excited because you're around, because you build them up and you encourage them? Or are you tearing them down every step of the way? Do you make the women around you feel uncomfortable with the words that you say that you try to brush off as a joke? with the way that you touch them and you say, no, we're just friendly. But actually, you're making people feel really uncomfortable and they don't fully know what to do. These are tough questions for us to ask ourselves. But when we answer them honestly, or even better, when we allow our friends, our kids, our coworkers, our significant others to genuinely answer those questions, we can actually grow as people. There is an author and a leader that I really look up to, and her name is Jess Connolly, and she says that we do things for the glory of God and the good of others. Those two things are linked. Being in pursuit of the glory of God does not require putting down other people, does not require you to abuse and misuse your power. And I hate to break it to all of us, but David's story is actually about to get even worse than what it already is. Let's go 2 Samuel verse 11, verse 6. Chapter 11, verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down into the house. David was told Uriah did not go home, so he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will do no such thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in the front, where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. So David is now facing the consequences of his very poor decisions. And he first tries to cover it up. But Uriah is like a man full of integrity and honor and was like, "No, I can't have all these benefits when everyone else is suffering." So the cover up isn't going to work. And so he has Uriah killed. We have all found ourselves in situations where it was like, this did not go according to plan. I messed up, I made a mistake. And we've all felt like we are in over our heads. And when we consistently live our lives in such a way where we are doing the things that we are not supposed to be doing, we are then living in a constant cycle of trying to cover things up, and the cover up and the stories that we have to keep and the lies we have to remember get bigger and bigger and bigger just because we don't want to face the consequences. We so desperately want to live life our way and not suffer for any of the decisions that we make, but that literally cannot happen. What you do in the dark can outshine your light. And then it honestly can set people up for generational failure and discouragement and struggle. 2 of David's sons actually end up repeating some of the mistakes that their dad made. One son sexually assaults his sister, and another son kills his brother and stages a rebellion against his dad, which chases David off the throne. When the rebellion ended, David was actually able to return, but he returned as a shell of himself. He was sad and defeated and in mourning. He was even mourning the son that tried to kill him. David, for each of us, is a textbook reminder that what you do in the dark can outshine your light. But there is really, really, really good news. The dark does not have the final say. The dark is not stronger than God's light and truth and love and grace. David, as a leader, could have had an uncomplicated legacy. He could have just been a great leader for God. He could have been the leader that we all dreamed that we could be. But God's grace is greater than David's mistake, and the same can be true and actually is true for you if you choose to accept it. Now, I am not standing here excusing the misuse of power, excusing treating someone else poorly. I am not here excusing murder. There needs to be accountability for the decisions that are made when people are and are not looking, for decisions that harm other people. And I am not a fool. I am aware that I am pursuing a calling to ministry, that we have watched leaders mess up, fumble, and ruin time and time and time again. I have seen lies and poor decisions ruin families, lead to heartbreak after heartbreak. And these decisions, they start small. No one wakes up and says, I'm going to ruin my life or ruin my family's life today. But oftentimes it starts off as this is the thing that's just taking the edge off of the situation. We sometimes can talk ourselves into thinking this small little decision is actually going to help me be a better friend, a better sibling, a better child, a better significant other. But then that thing grows and it becomes a priority, and eventually it becomes your whole life. That's why we have to be so smart with even the small decisions we make, which is why we shouldn't have secret lives. I once heard a podcaster say, I have a public life and I have a private life, but I never want a secret life, because secrets and secret lives are what ruin people and families and legacies. They are breeding grounds for disasters. And we have to realize that being a person after God's own heart doesn't mean perfection. Being a person after God's own heart is how you recover from sin. It looks like confession and repentance and community. It looks like changing your behavior. It looks like letting the light of God shine in the darkest and dingiest and scariest places in your life. So it is time to shed some light. Right now, begin thinking about a person that you trust, that you can go and confess to. Confess those secrets that live in the dark. Confess the secrets that you would be so scared that someone else might find out about. And do this today. Hopefully you've already thought of a couple people. This might be a pastor, but more likely it is a friend, it is a sibling, it is a significant other. It is someone else who truly loves Jesus and will walk with you through this. Someone who will help you defeat whatever is growing, whatever you are experiencing in the darkness. And if you are a person that someone confesses to today, be cool. Don't not take it seriously, right? We need to take the situation seriously, but don't run around and act like your hair is on fire. This is a moment for you to take it in. Thank them for sharing something so significant with you. Offer to help them take those next steps. Brainstorm what it looks like to get help, but also continue to be their friend. Still show up for meals and for good times together. Because here's what actually happens. David, man after God's own heart, makes a bunch of mistakes, has a really complicated legacy that we have to acknowledge. Jesus still comes from his family. We know that there is hope, and that hope comes from Jesus. That hope doesn't have to come from you and I behaving well or managing our lives well or being perfect. It comes from Jesus. It comes from Jesus coming to earth and living a perfect life and dying on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and defeating death on the third day. It comes from those moments, and the redeeming work of Jesus is greater than anything that can happen in the dark.